Ed Sullivan stood in Richard Pryor's dressing room 2 hours before showtime, and the 23-year-old comedian was holding a stack of index cards that Ed knew would destroy both their careers. It was May 1964, and Richard Pryor was scheduled to make his national television debut on The Ed Sullivan Show. Pryor had been doing safe Bill Cosby-style observational comedy for 2 years, carefully avoiding anything about race or politics. That comedy had gotten him the Sullivan booking. But the cards Pryor was now holding contained completely different material. Raw, honest jokes about being black in America, about racism, about poverty, about everything Ed Sullivan's Sunday evening audience absolutely could not handle. "Richard," Ed said carefully, "I've seen your act. You do great clean material about everyday situations. Stick with that. Don't do racial material. Don't talk about being black. White audiences won't understand it, and black audiences will think you're playing into stereotypes. Just be funny without being black. Can you do that?" Richard Pryor looked at Ed Sullivan with eyes that had seen more racism and poverty than Ed could imagine, and he said something that would change the trajectory of American comedy. "Mr. Sullivan, I've been pretending to be Bill Cosby for 2 years. I've been doing white comedy for white audiences, and I'm dying inside. So no, I can't just be funny without being black, because I am black, and tonight I'm going to talk about it." Before we dive into this incredible story, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to witness is the moment when Richard Pryor stopped pretending to be acceptable and became himself, and that decision transformed comedy forever. To understand why this moment was so profoundly dangerous and revolutionary, you need to understand where Richard Pryor had come from, what he was risking, and what pretending to be Bill Cosby had cost him. Richard Pryor had grown up in Peoria, Illinois, in poverty so devastating and circumstances so brutal that they would mark him permanently and profoundly. His mother, Gertrude, was a prostitute working in a brothel run by Richard's grandmother, Marie Carter. Richard had been raised literally inside that brothel, watching his mother service white men who treated her with open contempt, cruelty, and racist degradation. He'd experienced racism so brutal, so casual, so constant, that it had become the background radiation of his entire childhood. Richard had been beaten by white kids for being black. He'd been called the N-word so many times by the age of 10 that he'd stopped reacting to it. He'd watched his mother being abused, both physically and verbally, by white customers who saw her as less than human. He'd grown up understanding that in white America, black people, especially poor black people, especially black women selling their bodies to survive, were considered disposable, contemptible, worthy only of exploitation and abuse. By age 14, Richard had discovered that he could make people laugh. Comedy became his only escape from poverty, pain, and the trauma of his childhood. He started performing at local Peoria clubs, initially imitating successful black comedians like Dick Gregory, who'd broken through to white audiences with political humor, and especially Bill Cosby, who'd achieved unprecedented mainstream success. Bill Cosby in the early 1960s was revolutionary for a very specific reason. He did observational comedy that never mentioned race, never talked about being black, never made white audiences uncomfortable by forcing them to think about racial inequality or their own complicity in racism. Cosby talked about childhood, about universal human experiences, about things that could have come from a white comedian. This approach made Cosby seem safe, universal, non-threatening to white audiences, and it made him incredibly successful and wealthy. Richard Pryor spent 2 long, frustrating years from 1962 to 1964 trying desperately to become the next Bill Cosby. He wore nice suits and ties, told clean jokes about everyday situations like airplane food or relationships, never mentioned being black or experiencing racism, never talked about his childhood in a brothel or his mother's prostitution or the poverty that had defined his early life. This calculated approach got him bookings at white-owned comedy clubs, got him appearances on local television shows, and ultimately got him the Ed Sullivan Show opportunity, the biggest platform in American television. But the Bill Cosby imitation was also systematically killing Richard Pryor artistically, emotionally, and spiritually. Richard was suppressing absolutely everything that made him unique, interesting, and valuable. His specific experiences, his accumulated pain and trauma, his hard-earned truth about being black in America, in order to be acceptable and non-threatening to white audiences and white club owners and white television producers. Ed Sullivan had booked Richard because he seemed safe. He was a young black comedian doing Cosby-style material that wouldn't make white viewers uncomfortable. Ed expected Richard to do 5 minutes of observational comedy about airplane food or something similarly innocuous. What Ed didn't know was that 2 weeks before the Sullivan appearance, Richard Pryor had made a decision. He was done pretending. He was done suppressing his truth. He was going to start talking about being black in America, about racism, about poverty, about everything he'd been avoiding, even if it destroyed his career. The conversation in the dressing room was Richard's last chance to back down, to play it safe, to do the Bill Cosby routine that had gotten him this far. "Richard," Ed said, trying to sound reasonable, "I understand you want to talk about your experiences, but this isn't the right platform. The Ed Sullivan Show is family entertainment. We have audiences across America, North and South, black and white. Racial material will alienate half the audience and make the other half uncomfortable. You're so young, so talented. Don't hurt your career by being too controversial too soon." Richard had listened patiently. Then he responded with devastating clarity. "Mr. Sullivan, you're asking me to go on television and pretend I'm not black. You're asking me to ignore that I grew up in a whorehouse, that I've been called the N-word 1,000 times, that white people cross the street when they see me coming. You're asking me to be some universal comedian who could be any race. But I can't be any race. I'm black, and my comedy comes from being black in America. If I can't talk about that, I'm just doing a bad Bill Cosby impression." Ed had felt the situation slipping away. "Richard, Bill Cosby is hugely successful precisely because he doesn't talk about race. He's proven you can be a black comedian without making everything about race. Bill Cosby is Bill Cosby," Richard said, "and that works for him. But I'm not Bill Cosby. I'm Richard Pryor. And Richard Pryor grew up in a completely different world than Bill Cosby. If I pretend that world doesn't exist, I'm lying. And I won't lie anymore, not even to be on your show." Ed made his final argument. "If you do racial material tonight, you'll never be invited back. Other shows will hear about it. You'll be labeled as difficult, as too racial, as unmarketable to mainstream audiences. Is that really what you want?" Richard had stood up, holding his cards with the new material. "What I want is to stop hating myself. And I hate myself when I pretend to be something I'm not. So yes, I'm doing this material. And if that means I never do television again, at least I'll be able to look at myself in the mirror." May 24, 1964, 8:45 p.m. Eastern Time. Richard Pryor walked onto the Ed Sullivan Show stage wearing a suit and tie, looking young, nervous, and deceptively conventional. 50 million Americans watching had absolutely no idea they were about to witness the birth of modern confessional stand-up comedy. Richard started with the safe, Bill Cosby-style material he'd prepared as insurance, as Ed had requested. Jokes about everyday situations, universal observations that got polite, comfortable laughs from the predominantly white studio audience. Ed Sullivan, watching nervously from the wings, relaxed slightly. Maybe Richard had changed his mind about the racial material. Maybe he decided to play it safe after all. Then, about 3 minutes into his 5-minute set, Richard Pryor took a visible breath and shifted completely. He looked directly at the camera, making eye contact with 50 million Americans, and said with deliberate, careful emphasis, "You know, it's funny being black in America." Ed Sullivan's stomach immediately dropped. This was it. Richard was doing the racial material he'd been explicitly forbidden from doing. Richard continued, talking about his childhood in ways television audiences had never heard before. He talked about poverty without making it cute or palatable. He talked about the differences between how white and black people experience supposedly universal situations. He talked about racism not as abstract political concept, but as lived daily experience. The material wasn't angry or accusatory or bitter. It was honest and funny and deeply uncomfortably personal. Richard Pryor was talking about race on primetime family television in a way that had never been done before, bringing his actual life experiences to comedy instead of pretending those experiences didn't exist. The studio audience's response was complicated and divided. Many white audience members visibly looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats, uncertain whether they were allowed to laugh at this material. But some were laughing genuinely, recognizing profound truth in Richard's observations even when that truth made them uncomfortable. Black audience members scattered throughout the studio were responding even more strongly. Finally, astonishingly, someone was talking honestly about their experiences on national television, acknowledging their reality instead of pretending it away. Richard finished his set without incident but also without triumph. The applause was genuine but measured, not overwhelming. This wasn't a home run performance that would get Richard immediately invited back. This was something more complicated and historically significant, a seismic shift in what was considered possible on mainstream television. Backstage immediately after his set, Ed Sullivan confronted Richard with barely controlled anger and frustration. "You did exactly what I explicitly told you not to do. You talked about race. You made the audience uncomfortable." "I know," Richard said calmly, without apology. "You understand you're never appearing on this show again? That I'll make sure other producers know you can't be trusted to follow instructions?" "I know that too." Ed paused, genuinely puzzled by Richard's calm acceptance. "Then why did you do it? You could have had a real career doing safe comedy. You threw that away for 5 minutes of racial material that made half the audience uncomfortable." Richard looked at Ed with complete, devastating honesty. "Because having a career doing comedy I hate, comedy that requires me to pretend I'm not black, comedy that denies everything I've experienced that isn't a career. That's a prison. That's slow death. I'd genuinely rather fail being Richard Pryor than succeed being a bad Bill Cosby imitation." Ed Sullivan never invited Richard Pryor back to his show. But something completely unexpected happened in the weeks and months following that May 1964 performance. The performance itself, controversial and uncomfortable as it had been, got Richard noticed by exactly the right people. Comedy clubs that catered to black audiences and progressive white audiences wanted to book him specifically because he'd been willing to talk honestly about race. Young comedians saw Richard's performance and recognized permission to be more personal, more honest, more themselves. Over the next decade, Richard Pryor systematically revolutionized American stand-up comedy. He proved definitively that comedy could be deeply personal, brutally honest about painful experiences, and still be profoundly funny, sometimes more funny because of the honesty rather than despite it. He talked about race, about poverty, about addiction, about sex, about violence, about everything previous generations of comedians had carefully avoided. He made his pain and his truth into comedy that was both hilarious and devastating. Richard became one of the most influential comedians in American history. Comedians as diverse as Chris Rock, Dave Chappelle, Louis C.K., and countless others have cited Richard Pryor as their primary influence, as the comedian who showed them that personal truth and honesty could be the foundation of great comedy. Before his death in 2005, Richard spoke frequently about that 1964 Ed Sullivan Show appearance. "Ed wanted me to be a black comedian who never mentioned being black. He wanted me safe and acceptable, and I'd been trying to be that for 2 years. But that night, I decided to stop lying. I decided to be Richard Pryor instead of a bad Bill Cosby copy. Ed banned me from his show for it. But that decision to be myself, even when it cost me television, that saved my life and my career." If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button. Richard Pryor refused to suppress his truth, got banned from Ed Sullivan, and changed comedy forever by being himself. Share your story in the comments below.